I used to think the strangest thing that could happen in our neighborhood was somebody forgetting to bring their trash cans in before Monday morning. We were 7 custom homes tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac outside Cedar Ridge, the kind of place where everybody waved even if they secretly couldn't stand each other, where kids rode bikes until sunset, and where the little pond behind our back fences somehow made every stressful day feel a little lighter. And one spring morning I walked outside with my coffee and a handful of stale bread, ready to feed the ducks like I'd done for years, and found a 6-foot metal fence cutting straight across the shoreline. Orange construction tape fluttered in the breeze. A locked gate stood where open grass used to be, and a bright white sign announced that the pond was now closed, wildlife feeding was prohibited, and anyone violating the rule would face HOA fines. I honestly thought it was some kind of prank until I looked past the fence and saw the ducks paddling in tight circles, confused, trapped against the reeds because someone had literally fenced off part of the shoreline. I just stood there holding my coffee, wondering how in the world anybody thought this was normal. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 53 years old, and I bought my house because of that pond, not because it raised the property value, not because it looked pretty on real estate listings, but because after 30 years working as a utility engineer, solving problems and dealing with angry contractors every day, I wanted one peaceful place where the loudest sound I'd hear in the morning was ducks arguing over stale bread. Every spring it became my little ritual. I'd step onto my cedar deck, sip my coffee, toss out a few pieces of bread, and watch the water wake up. My wife used to joke that the ducks recognized my truck before they recognized each other. She passed away 4 years ago, but I never stopped that tradition because somehow it still made the place feel alive. So when I saw that fence, it didn't just feel inconvenient. It felt personal. I marched straight across the street to the home of our HOA president, Diane Porter. Diane wasn't one of those loud people who yelled all the time. She was worse. She smiled while talking down to you, the kind of person who made every sentence sound like she was explaining something obvious to a child. She opened the door before I even knocked twice. "Morning, Ethan," she said without smiling. "I figured you'd be stopping by." "You figured right," I answered. "What's with the fence?" She folded her arms like she'd rehearsed the conversation. "It's for community safety. Too many residents have been feeding wildlife. We've decided to restrict access." I looked at her for a second, waiting for the punchline. "You've decided?" I asked. "Since when does the HOA own the pond?" She tilted her head ever so slightly. "We've always managed it." "Managing isn't owning. According to our records," she replied, "the association has authority over the pond, and frankly, that's all you need to worry about." There was something about the way she said "according to our records" that stuck in my head. She sounded confident, maybe a little too confident. I asked one more question. "Can I see those records?" She gave me that same polished smile. "Check the property filings yourself." Then she quietly closed the door. I walked home irritated, but something deeper than anger had already started growing. Curiosity. I spent my entire career reading engineering surveys, easement maps, utility plats, and legal descriptions. Maybe most people would have accepted what she said and complained to neighbors over barbecue. I couldn't. That evening, my dining room table disappeared beneath county maps, old closing documents, tax records, and plat drawings I'd kept in a filing cabinet since the day we bought the house. I traced property lines with a yellow pencil until nearly midnight. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then one tiny notation near the shoreline caught my eye. The parcel number attached to the pond didn't match any HOA-owned common area. I checked again. Same result. I downloaded county GIS maps. Same parcel number. Then I opened the tax assessment database. Same thing again. The pond wasn't listed under the homeowners association at all. In fact, it wasn't privately owned by anybody in the neighborhood. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long minute, hearing Diane's voice repeat in my head. "According to our records." Well, according to the county's records. Those weren't her records to begin with. That's when I realized this wasn't going to end with a neighborly disagreement over ducks. Somebody had either made an incredible mistake, or they were counting on nobody ever checking the truth for themselves. And once I realized that, there was absolutely no chance I was letting it go. For the next 2 days, I probably called more government offices than most people do in a lifetime. I started with a county assessor because property ownership seemed like the obvious place to begin, then moved to the GIS department, the planning office, the parks division, and finally natural resources. Every conversation gave me another small piece of the puzzle, but nobody seemed willing to give me a complete answer. One clerk told me, "Well, that's an unusual situation." Another admitted, "I'm looking at the parcel and, honestly, it doesn't appear to belong to the HOA." None of them wanted to make an official statement over the phone, but every answer nudged me in the same direction. Diane had either misunderstood the law for years, or she decided everyone else would simply believe whatever she said. Meanwhile, the fence stayed exactly where it was. Every morning I'd walk out with my coffee out of habit before remembering there wasn't much point anymore. The ducks still gathered along the shoreline, swimming back and forth near the locked gate like they expected someone to let them through. Even my next-door neighbor, Mark Henderson, wandered over one afternoon carrying his lawnmower and shook his head. "This whole thing feels ridiculous," he muttered. "You planning to fight them?" I laughed. "Already am." He looked toward Diane's house before lowering his voice. "Careful? She likes winning more than she likes being right." That sentence stayed with me. Some people chase money. Some chase power. Diane seemed addicted to control itself. Looking back, the pond had never really been about ducks or safety. Over the years, she'd complained about everything from kayak colors to holiday decorations. Last summer, she'd actually tried banning wind chimes because she claimed they disrupted neighborhood tranquility. Nobody took her seriously then, but enough people avoided confrontation that she slowly learned something dangerous. If she sounded confident enough, most folks simply complied. I wasn't interested in arguing personalities anymore. I wanted facts. On the third morning, my persistence finally paid off. A wildlife management specialist named Rachel Monroe returned one of my messages. She didn't waste time with small talk. "Mr. Walker," she said, "tell me exactly what's happening." So I started from the beginning. I described the fence stretching across the shoreline, the lock gate, the HOA notice threatening fines, the ducks boxed into one section of the pond, and Diane's insistence that the association owned the water. Rachel interrupted only once. "Do you have photographs?" "Plenty." "Good," she replied. "Email every single one. Include wide shots, close-ups, signs, fences, everything." There was something in her voice that immediately got my attention. She wasn't surprised. She sounded concerned. 20 minutes later, I'd sent more than 30 photos along with screenshots of county parcel maps and copies of the HOA notice. About an hour after that, my phone rang again. Rachel spoke slower this time. "Mr. Walker, unless I'm missing something, this appears to involve public conservation property." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning your homeowners association may have erected barriers on land they don't control." I sat there smiling without realizing it. "So I'm not crazy." She actually laughed. "No, sir. If these records are accurate, someone else may have been." She promised to forward everything to environmental compliance and city land management. Honestly, I expected weeks of waiting. Government usually moves about as fast as wet concrete. Instead, just after lunch the very same day, 2 white pickup trucks rolled quietly into our neighborhood without any city logos on the doors. 2 inspectors climbed out carrying cameras, clipboards, measuring wheels, and GPS equipment. They didn't ask permission from the HOA. They didn't stop at Diane's house first. They walked directly to the pond. Curtains started moving all over the neighborhood as people peeked through windows pretending not to watch. Diane came outside within minutes wearing sunglasses and that same confident expression she'd worn at my front door. She marched toward one of the inspectors. I couldn't hear every word from my deck, but I caught enough. "This is private property," she insisted. The older inspector looked down at his tablet before calmly answering, "According to our records, no, it isn't." I don't think I'll ever forget Diane's face. It wasn't anger. It was confusion, the kind people wear when reality suddenly refuses to cooperate with the story they've been telling themselves. The inspectors spent nearly 2 hours documenting everything. They measured how far the fence extended into protected shoreline. They photographed the gate from every angle. They recorded the warning signs and even noted the nesting areas around the reeds. Then, just before sunset, another truck arrived. This one actually belonged to State Wildlife Services. A uniformed conservation officer stepped out, walked directly to the locked gate, examined the chain for maybe 5 seconds, unlatched it, swung the gate open, and left it standing there without saying a single dramatic word. That quiet gesture somehow carried more authority than any speech ever could. Diane stormed over immediately. "You can't do that," she snapped. The officer barely looked at her. "Ma'am," he replied evenly, "I already did." Then he continued inspecting the shoreline as if the conversation had ended before it began. By the following morning, our mailboxes held something nobody expected. Every homeowner received a notice explaining that an investigation into unauthorized restrictions on public conservation property was underway. Diane's mailbox contained a much thicker envelope. I happened to be watering my flowers when she pulled the papers out. Even from across the street, I watched the color drain from her face page after page. She looked up toward the pond, then toward my house. And for the first time since this whole mess started, she looked uncertain. Rumors spread faster than reeds after that. One neighbor claimed the city was threatening massive penalties. Another insisted the HOA's insurance company had already been contacted. Someone else swore the board had scheduled an emergency meeting behind closed doors. Nobody knew exactly what was true, but one thing became obvious. The confidence Diane had worn like armor was disappearing by the hour. 3 days later, official notices confirmed everything. The city concluded the pond was protected public property managed under environmental conservation agreements. The HOA had no authority to restrict access, no authority to install barriers, and certainly no authority to issue fines for activities they didn't legally control. Worse than that, investigators determined the fence interfered with wildlife habitat and obstructed access to protected shoreline. Suddenly, this wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. It had become a legal problem with expensive consequences. A hearing was scheduled less than 2 weeks later. Diane still insisted the board had acted in good faith, but even some of her closest supporters had stopped defending her. I remember sitting on my deck the evening before the hearing, watching the ducks glide peacefully through the open gate the conservation officer had left unlocked. For the first time in weeks, they weren't circling in confusion. Neither was I. Whatever happened inside that courtroom tomorrow, the truth had finally caught up with the story Diane had been telling everyone, and I had a feeling it was about to become very expensive. The hearing finally arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, and somehow the courthouse felt quieter than our neighborhood had been in weeks. I expected a packed courtroom and a dramatic legal showdown, but the atmosphere was almost unsettling in its simplicity. The judge walked in carrying a thick binder full of reports, maps, inspection notes, and environmental records. Before anyone even spoke, I had a feeling this case wasn't going to be decided by clever arguments or emotional speeches. It was going to come down to facts, and facts don't care who serves as HOA president. Diane Porter sat at the defense table beside the association's attorney, dressed as professionally as ever, but the confidence she'd worn like a tailored jacket had completely disappeared. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from spending too many nights realizing every decision you made is about to be examined under a microscope. The city's attorney began with something surprisingly simple. Instead of launching into legal jargon, he projected an aerial photograph of our neighborhood onto a large screen. 7 homes, 1 pond, 1 metal fence stretching across protected shoreline. Then he overlaid the official county parcel map. The property boundaries lit up in different colors, and within seconds, even someone who had never read a survey before could understand the truth. The pond wasn't inside the HOA's property. It never had been. It belonged to the city under a conservation easement established years before our subdivision was even built. The attorney calmly explained that every deed, every tax record, every GIS map, and every environmental filing pointed to exactly the same conclusion. Then he presented my photographs. There was the locked gate. There was the warning sign threatening homeowners with fines. There were the ducks pressed against the fencing, searching for open water. There were the inspection photos showing nesting areas blocked by steel posts driven into protected shoreline. The judge studied every image carefully before turning toward Diane. "Mrs. Porter," he asked in an even voice, "before authorizing this project, did the homeowners association verify ownership through the county?" Diane hesitated. It wasn't a dramatic pause. It was the kind that happens when someone knows the truthful answer is also the most damaging one they can possibly give. Her attorney finally stood and admitted the board had relied on historical assumptions and internal HOA files rather than official government records. Historical assumptions. Those two words echoed through the courtroom because everyone immediately understood what they really meant. Nobody had verified anything. They simply assumed they were right because nobody had questioned them before. The judge slowly removed his glasses and leaned back for a moment before speaking again. "Authority," he said quietly, "cannot be created through repetition. It must be supported by law." That single sentence probably carried more weight than the rest of the hearing combined. He went on to explain that blocking access to publicly managed conservation property constituted a serious violation. Installing physical barriers that interfered with wildlife habitat created additional environmental penalties. Threatening residents with unauthorized enforcement actions exposed the association to civil liability. Every violation stacked on top of the last until the numbers became impossible to ignore. By the end of the ruling, the HOA faced $65,000 in fines, mandatory removal of every section of fencing, reimbursement for inspection costs, a written public apology to every homeowner, and a professionally supervised shoreline restoration program to repair the damage caused by construction. Diane didn't protest. She didn't argue. She simply nodded once while staring at the table in front of her. Walking out of that courthouse, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt relieved. Relief is a funny emotion. It isn't loud. It doesn't celebrate. It simply lets you breathe again after weeks of carrying something heavy. A few reporters waiting outside asked whether I felt satisfied. I remember answering, I never wanted anyone punished. I just wanted the truth to matter. A week later, just after sunrise, several city trucks rolled quietly into the neighborhood. Workers unloaded cutting torches, loaders, and trailers while environmental officers supervised every step. I watched from my deck with another cup of coffee in my hands, standing almost exactly where this entire story had begun. Sparks flew as workers cut through the steel posts. Sections of fencing crashed under the trailers one by one. The bright orange warning tape disappeared into trash bins. The locked gate that had become such an ugly symbol of unnecessary control was lifted away by a small crane and loaded onto a flatbed truck. Within a few hours, it was as though the fence had never existed at all. The shoreline looked open again. Wind rippled across the water uninterrupted. Even the neighborhood felt different. People who hadn't spoken much during the dispute wandered outside and started chatting near their mailboxes. Mark walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee and handed me one with a grin. "Looks better this way," he said. "Yeah," I answered, watching the sunlight reflect across the pond. It always did. Neither of us said much after that because we didn't really need to. Sometimes silence says enough. Later that afternoon, the ducks slowly drifted back toward the shoreline. At first, they seemed cautious, almost suspicious of the place where the fence had stood. Then, one by one, they swam through the open water exactly as they always had before. I reached into my pocket, broke apart a few pieces of bread, and tossed them gently across the surface. Within seconds, they rushed over, flapping and quacking like nothing unusual had ever happened. I actually laughed out loud because nature has a remarkable way of refusing to hold grudges. People remember conflicts. Ducks just move on once the obstacle disappears. Looking back now, I realized this story was never really about bread, ducks, or even a pond. It was about something far more common than most of us like to admit. Too often people mistake confidence for correctness. Someone speaks with enough certainty, flashes an official-looking document, hangs a sign on a fence, and suddenly everyone assumes they must have the authority they claim. Most of the time, nobody checks because checking takes effort, and challenging authority feels uncomfortable. But rights don't disappear because someone sounds convincing. Facts don't change because a board votes on them. Truth is still truth, even when it's buried beneath years of assumptions. Our HOA elected a completely new board within a few months. Meetings became shorter, decisions became more transparent, and residents actually started asking questions instead of quietly accepting every new rule. Diane eventually sold her house and moved away. I don't know where she ended up, and honestly, I don't wish her any harm. I hope she found a place where she realized leadership isn't about controlling people, it's about serving them. As for me, every spring I still carry my coffee onto that same cedar deck before the sun climbs over the trees. I still watch the ducks glide across the pond, and every single time I smile because they remind me that peace isn't something you appreciate until somebody tries to fence it off. But here's the question I still wrestle with sometimes. If I had looked at that sign, shrugged my shoulders, and walked back inside, would anyone else have ever questioned it? Would that fence still be standing today simply because nobody challenged the assumption behind it? I'd really like to hear what you think. Was Diane simply trying to protect the neighborhood and made a costly mistake? Or did she abuse the little bit of authority she thought she had? Have you ever dealt with an HOA, neighborhood board, or local official who acted as though their opinion carried the force of law? Share your experience down in the comments, because these conversations matter. And sometimes hearing someone else's story gives another person the courage to stand up for their own rights. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes ordinary people can't stand up to organizations that think they're untouchable. Sometimes the biggest victories don't come from shouting the loudest. They come from quietly opening the right records, asking the right questions, and refusing to let the truth stay locked behind someone else's fence.